Excited that you're here tonight. Welcome to Atlanta History Center. My name is Claire Haley. I'm our Vice President of Democracy Initiatives and Author Talks, and it's absolutely my pleasure to welcome you all to tonight's author event featuring Timothy Egan. He will be discussing his new book, A Fever in the Heartland, the Ku Klux Klan's plot to take over America and the woman who stopped them. It is a recent New York Times bestseller, so big congratulations to Timothy for that. And it was named one of the top nonfiction books to read this spring by the New York Times as well. If you have not yet purchased your copy of the book, I see several of you have it in your hands, but if you don't have it yet, it's 25% off tonight only. Timothy will also be out in the lobby after the event signing those books. If you purchase your copy tonight before, it is pre-signed, but if you want it personalized or if you'd like some extra ones signed, he'll be available to do that for you tonight. A quick logistical note, we will be recording tonight's conversation, so if you'll do me a big favor, take out that cell phone that's likely in your pocket and just make sure that it's on off, that you don't have any fun alarms planned or anything like that. We would really appreciate it tonight. Now to introduce tonight's guests, and we'll kick off the conversation. Timothy Egan is tonight's author. He's a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter and author of 10 books. His book on the Dust Bowl, The Worst Hard Time, won the National Book Award for Nonfiction. Another book on photographer Edward Curtis, Short Nights of the Shadow Catcher, was awarded the Carnegie Medal for Nonfiction. He's also written several New York Times bestsellers, including The Immortal Irishman and, of course, tonight's book. He's a third-generation Westerner and writes a weekly opinion column for the New York Times. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Timothy Egan.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming out on this beautiful spring evening. So I flew all the way across the country today. I live in the Pacific Northwest. This is my first ever time in Atlanta. And boy, is it beautiful. I did not expect it. I mean, it's always like this, right? Oh, no, yeah. Thank you. Everyone's made me feel at home, too. I just had a run in the park and walking around, and this is just soul uplifting. I actually haven't seen the sun for 6 months, so this is a pretty big deal for me. So we're going to talk about a pretty hard part of our history tonight, and a story that's somewhat hard. Forget the somewhat. That's hard to tell, but it's worth telling. It also has heroes as well as a monster at the center of this story. I'm a great believer, I got this from my mother, that, by the way, it's so great to be here among just lovers of history in general, that there's no such thing as boring history, there's just boringly told history. And as I was researching this book, I came across a quote from Harry Truman, who briefly was asked to join the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s when it was at its peak. And after they told him they hate Jews, Catholics, blacks, and immigrants, he said he didn't want to join. But Harry said, "The only new thing in the world is the history we do not know." And ladies and gentlemen, this story I'm going to tell you tonight is a history we largely do not know. So we think of the Roaring '20s as, Gatsby time, bootleggers, jazz, the cultural exuberance of the day, flappers, women newly liberated, women given the vote for the first time, but prohibition, so all the drinking is going on illegally. In fact, alcohol use spiked hugely during prohibition. But it was also a fairly dark time. It was a time when, as I got into the story, I saw it's a time where I thought, if you want to understand the 2020s, you got to understand the 1920s, because you could see this sort of stuff going through our history. And today, those who want to turn back the demographic clock, those who are suspicious of science, those who are intolerant of new lifestyles, those who fear others because they don't look or act as the majority looks, I'm sad to say we'll find a not-so-distant mirror in the 1920s. Now, my last book was a pilgrimage. My mother had just died. She was a very devout Catholic, and on her deathbed, I was one of 7 kids. I am one of 7 kids, and she said, "Honey, I'm just not feeling it. I don't know what's on the other side." And so I sort of made it my goal to explore my really lapsed Catholic faith, and I walked this pilgrimage trail, 1,200 miles through Europe. The Via Francigena. And it's very just great fascinating thing for me. But after that, I wanted to do something a little closer to home. So I'd always heard about the Ku Klux Klan in Oregon. And, Oregon is thought to be this uber woke state, and it kind of is now, but it actually was a real hotbed for the Ku Klux Klan of the 1920s. They had a Klan governor, Walter Pierce, who was elected on an open Klan platform in 1921. They were the only state in the nation by vote of the people, to outlaw Catholic schools. And they did this because the people who went to Catholic schools were largely immigrants. And that meant a lot of Italians and Irish, and they didn't like them. So they outlawed Catholic schools, made it illegal for immigrants to own land. They elected this governor, Walter M. Pierce, whose slogan was, "Keeping America a land for Americans." And then I started looking at the bigger picture. And as a journalist, it's your job to follow the story. And I was absolutely stunned at what I found. The Klan of the 1920s was vast. It was everywhere, and its headquarters were in the North, not in the old Confederacy, but in the North. They were much more entrenched in daily life. They were much more entrenched in politics. They were much more part of the fabric of everyday living than the original terror group founded in the 1860s and 1870s. They had, and this was hard for me to get my mind around, at their peak in 1925, they had 6 million members. 6 million Americans put their hand on a Bible and swore to, quote, "forever uphold white supremacy." 6 million of them. They had 4 elected United States senators, open Klansmen. They had at least 3 governors. They had 75 members of Congress were under their sway. They had an office in Washington, D.C., staffed by 60 Klansmen, 6 blocks from the White House. And their goal, ladies and gentlemen, 1925, was a Klan from sea to sea, anchored in the White House. And now that may seem preposterous, but they were on their way till doing it, till the story I'm going to tell you happened. Colorado, we think of it as another progressive state, elected a Klan governor in 1924. His name was Clarence Morley, on the very same day that Indiana put a Klansman, Ed Jackson, in their state house. And the Colorado governor's motto, again, this is supposed to be a secretive society, the invisible empire. His motto was, "Every man under the Capitol dome, a Klansman." And then he proceeded to try to fire all Jews, Catholics, and blacks who worked at the state's flagship university. This is the United States of America, 1924, in the roaring 20s. Anaheim, California, was so Klan-infested, its nickname was Klanaheim. The Imperial Wizard, that is the head honcho of the Klan, toured the United States at peak of the Klan power in 1924, and he told thousands of people who filled a stadium in Denver, Colorado, to get their initiation, to put their hand on that Bible, that they had just, quote, "joined the most wonderful movement the world has ever seen." So my job was to figure out the why. My job was to go and try to understand the texture. How do seemingly Rockwellian, normal, everyday Americans turn to hate? And how does a violent hate group become such an integral part of the American Midwest? Not, as I said, in the old Confederacy, but in the North. So before I get to this why, my explanation for this, let me give you a brief history of the Klan. Most of you know this, but it's worth repeating. The first Klan was founded right after the Civil War by 6 ex-Confederates who got together in a basement in Pulaski, Tennessee, 1866. And they were reacting, and the Klan that formed following them was in reaction to one startling and simple fact. 4 million people, 36% of the population of the South, went from being enslaved to being American citizens. And that's what the Klan was a reaction to. 4 million people, newly liberated, and that's what they were formed to. And they were a terror group. They were an outright violent terror group. They burned, pillaged, raped, rampaged, murdered without, they had sheriffs on their side, and very few of them were ever prosecuted. They would maraud at night, and their main thing was to try to make people think that they were ghosts. So they would sometimes have these these skeleton hands underneath their robes. They wanted people to think they were the ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers out to get vengeance, riding in the night. But then the next day after a raid, that person who'd just gone out marauding may be the person who serves you your dinner. It may be the person who's the merchant. It may be the person who's your preacher. A lot of preachers were in the Klan. They were crushed by President Ulysses S. Grant, who got his due in Ron Chernow's terrific biography that came out a few years ago. Grant abhorred the Klan. He called them, quote, the most atrocious organization the civilized part of the world has ever seen. And he declared martial law. He put 5,000 Klansmen in federal prisons. He sent federal troops to the South to prosecute them and put them in jail. So by the mid-1870s, that Klan, that original Klan, was gone. They had disappeared. They dissolved their membership list. They had public statements saying, it's done, it's over. And so it seemingly was gone forever. 50 years later, in this state, on Stone Mountain, on Thanksgiving evening, 1915, the second Klan forms. Now, this was a reaction to a couple of things, which I'll get into here in some detail, but a little small thing, which I think everyone here knows about. Leo Frank was a Jewish shop superintendent who was accused of murdering a 13-year-old girl, and the evidence against him was faulty, but he was convicted nonetheless as people chanted death to the Jew outside. This was here in Atlanta. The governor commuted his sentence from death by execution to life in prison. And that night, people stormed the prison. With the aid of insiders, they grabbed Leo Frank and they took him out and they lynched him. And no one was ever brought to justice for this crime. 4 of those men in that lynch mob were among the 15 men who walked up Stone Mountain, Georgia, on Thanksgiving Eve in 1915, put a Bible on a rock, looked up to the heavens to a God that in their mind was a very discriminating God, and started the second Klan. The second Klan. Now, the first Klan did not do cross burnings. That came about the second Klan, and they got it from what really gave a push to this second Klan was a film, The Birth of a Nation. This was an epic fictional rewrite of what happened during Reconstruction. It was also a brilliant film in the sense that it did things that no one had ever done. They had a cast of 25,000 people. They used 80,000 yards of white muslin cloth to outfit their Klansmen. They had action shots. It was a silent film. Played for 2.5 hours, played before 1 in every 4 Americans saw this film. And it was the first film to ever play in the White House, Woodrow Wilson's White House. It was a powerful piece of fiction, though. It was a powerful piece of propaganda. And that's exactly what the director wanted. He said later, I wanted to change the narrative of the Civil War. I wanted to change the narrative of Reconstruction. So in his film, all the blacks were slovenly, subhuman. They were members of the legislature, but they didn't have shoes on. They threw chicken bones in the aisles, and they swigged whiskey in the aisles. And they were depicted as basically just rapacious and subhuman. Northerners were all carpetbaggers, and the only heroes were the Ku Klux Klan. So this group that had been outlawed, had been disappeared 50 years earlier, suddenly in this film that 1 in 4 Americans are seeing are heroic. They ride to the rescue. They get rid of the carpetbaggers. They go after the rapacious African Americans. They save damsels in distress. They're heroic. And at the end of this film, it's a silent film, orchestra down here below, on a typescript of the screen across, which 25 million Americans said, are these words: the former enemies of the North and the South are united again in common defense of their Aryan birthright. So it was pure propaganda, but brilliant propaganda. It played very well in the North, played well in the South, but it played very well in the North. Now, as I'm following this story, and everything I've told you so far is somewhat familiar. Most people know about that Klan that started here in Georgia. What I didn't know, and I've been touring for this book now for 2 weeks, and everyone says they didn't know this. was the dead center of the 1920s Ku Klux Klan, was the dead center of the United States. It was Indiana, the quintessential American state. 1 in 3 white males, 300,000 men, put their hand on that Bible and swore out their oath to white supremacy. 1 in 3. There are 92 counties in the state of Indiana. All but 2 of them had a Klan chapter. They had, as I mentioned, a Klan governor, open Klansman, outed, didn't give a shit. Just, yeah, I'm a Klansman, proud of it. They had a Klan legislature, as it was called, run by the Grand Dragon. They had all members of their congressional delegation were loyal to the Klan. Now, it's important to note that they didn't invent this brand of hatred. They expanded it, certainly in the 20s, against Jews, against immigrants, against Catholics, somewhat against women, because women were socially liberated in the 20s and they didn't like that. But they didn't necessarily invent this, they more played to it. And I found a quote in Indiana's leading paper, not the Klan paper, their leading mainstream paper, the Indianapolis Star, that explains this attitude. This is 1921. Quote, this is an editorial in the leading paper in Indiana. The Negro is among us, and the race should be encouraged to progress, but that path should never lead to social mingling. So that's where my story starts, and it begins with a drifter who rolls into southern Indiana in Evansville on the border of Kentucky, just across the Ohio River. A classic American archetype, a charismatic con man named D.C. Stevenson. In 4 short years, he rises from, as he said, a nobody from nowhere to the most powerful political figure in the upper Midwest, controlling 21 states of Klansmen, an empire of the Klan in the north, and controlling all of Indiana, 300,000 Hoosiers following his every dictate, which he sends out like a Wizard of Oz, the all-powerful Oz, sending out these summonses and these proclamations. Now, how did he do this? How does a guy who knocked around from town to town, never really made any money, ditched a wife back in Oklahoma, got kicked out of the military because all the other soldiers hated him, he stole from them. How did this guy suddenly become, in 4 short years, the most powerful man in Indiana and the upper Midwest? Well, that's one of the things I try to show in this book, is the sort of tick-tock, the daily turns that made a quintessential American state throughout so many American values. He started with Protestant preachers. Now, I mentioned I'm a lapsed Catholic, but I'm also a man of faith, so I don't trash people who believe in faith. In fact, I'm really impressed by people who believe in faith, and people who act on faith. Martin Luther King Jr., of course, acted on faith. But these preachers that D.C. Stevenson bribed for usually $50, $100, would preach the word of hate along with the word of God. What they preached from Sunday was the Klan was your neighbor, and that you should hate your neighbor if he is Catholic or Jewish or black or immigrant. So he built his foundation with the churches, town to town, bribed a minister, and his top aide said they were such easy marks. We'd go into one of these churches, we'd bribe the minister, and a week later we'd have half the congregation had signed up to join the Klan. And then he infiltrated fraternal orders. This was the golden age of fraternal orders. Elks, Oddfellows, Eagles, Redmen. If you were an American man in the 1920s and you didn't belong to one of these secret societies, you probably didn't belong. And he stole a lot of their silly rituals, their secret handshakes. They had a Klan signal they made that everyone, he created this crazy, nutty, secret language. He got those from the fraternity orders. Now, he didn't want his Klan to be just for men. He wanted the invisible empire to expand to the whole family. So he enlisted women. And many of these women had been suffragettes. They were for equality. And Stevenson brilliantly thought, see, the Klan was always afraid to give women the vote because they thought, if we give women the vote, that'll be black women as well. And eventually this will be a pushback against Jim Crow. But then the other side of that is, if we give women the vote, there'll be lots of white women who will sign up for white supremacy. And that's exactly what happened. Within a few years of founding his Klan's women's auxiliaries, they had more than 2 million women have formed the Klan's women's auxiliary. Worst of all, folks, he started something called the Ku Klux Kiddies. And these were children, 9, 10, 11 years old, who would meet in their little dens just like Boy Scouts or Cub Scouts. But when they met in these dens, they would put their hoods on, put their masks on, put their robes on, and talk about all the people they were supposed to hate. And you'll see pictures in this book of the Ku Klux Kiddies at parades. And it was a family Klan. So that's what he got every level of the family. Now, it's also important to note that he had a morality patrol. Because remember, I talked about the Klan, one of their opponents in the 20s was women, the jazz-age women. My granny was a flapper. She used to tell us stories about drinking bathtub gin and dancing all night and coming home at 3 in the morning. And she said it was the greatest time of her life. You don't think it when your granny tells you that. You know, you go, Granny, behave. Klan didn't like it. So they had these 30,000 men in the state of Indiana were legally deputized to harass the opponents, the seeming opponents of Klan virtue. And they would go out at night with their little flashlights and their guns, and they would look for cars that were parked and lovers that might be embracing each other and kissing. And they'd break them up. They would go to these speakeasies, mainly on Indiana Avenue, which was the main African-American strip, great jumping series of joints, jazz clubs, and break them up. They would go into Jewish shops, retailers who were open on Sunday, and order them to close. All of this is happening in the United States of America. It sounds like the Taliban. That's what it sounded like to me. Now, Stevenson's Klansmen were not your stereotypical dumbass guys living under a bridge or coming out of a basement. They were the people who held their communities together. They were coaches, they were teachers, they were bankers, they were merchants, they were a lot of preachers, there were a lot of politicians. They were the so-called everyday folks who held their communities together. Doctors. He had a lot of dentists. There's something about dentists in the Klan, but they really liked it. I never understood that. It's one of the things my editor said. She goes, what's up with these dentists in the Klan? The imperial wizard, Hiram Wesley Evans, was an ex-dentist. Stevenson's formula was simple, and it was chilling. In one of his many interviews, when he started to become quite grandiose and started to look at the White House, he said, I did not sell the Klan in the Midwest on hatreds. I sold it on Americanisms. So his Klan rallies had oompa bands, and his Klan rallies had little kids with lemonade stands, and his Klan rallies had barbershop quartets. And there was a Klan baseball team with Ku Klux Klan stitched across the flannel of the front, and they would play all over Indiana. But what did D.C. Stevenson mean when he said, I sold it on Americanisms? Well, it was everything I just said, but it was one more thing. This America, 100 years ago, belonged, and they made no bones about this, belonged to exclusively one race and one religion. One race and one religion. And I want to emphasize that joining the Klan was not cheap. It cost you several days' wages, the average person's wages, to pay for the initiation fee. And then you had to buy the robes, all the outfits, which were sold only through Klan-initiated, Klan-sponsored retailers. You may have figured it out by now, but Stevenson became a very wealthy man because he got a cut of every initiation fee. And within 4 years, he was worth, in modern dollars, $28 million. He realized there was a fortune to be made out of the renewable hate of a certain segment of Americans. Now, what animated this 1920s Klan? What were the macro forces that was animating it? First of all, prohibition. It was the number one goal of the early Klan was to outlaw alcohol in every square foot of the United States. Now, why did they have such a thing for alcohol? Well, because immigrants. They thought, alcohol is the social lubricant of these Italians who were coming into the country. Alcohol is the social lubricant of these damn Irish who are meeting in their pubs, and that's where many of them became Americans, was in pubs and bars. That's where they learned their acts of citizenship. And finally, alcohol was the thing that was allowing women to go out at night and dance and be socially free. So that was Prohibition, which Winston Churchill had called an affront to the entire history of mankind. Now, I say that, but you got to realize Churchill never went any 24-hour period without alcohol in his bloodstream, so take that with a grain of salt. So they did this with great virulence. And a couple of interesting side things that came about during Prohibition. Walgreens, which is now on every corner of America. I just drove all the way through Wisconsin last week, and I decided to drive instead of take planes. And Walgreens you can't go a mile without seeing a Walgreens. They got their start in the 20s because of Prohibition. There were only 5 Walgreens in 1920. At the end of the 20s, there were more than 5,000. Why? Because one of the ways people got around Prohibition was you'd get your doctor to write a prescription for medicinal alcohol, and you'd take that prescription into Walgreens. And so once a week you could get 8 ounces of pure booze from Walgreens, and it made Walgreens what it is today. They were so fanatical in Indiana, they outlawed sauerkraut because it had a little small percentage of alcohol in it because of the fermentation. And they didn't like it. The Germans were behind it, mainly Germans, Catholics, so they outlawed that. They passed something called the Bone Dry Law in 1925 that outlawed an empty bottle if you could still smell booze inside of it. That was the first thing, Prohibition. The second thing was fear of others, which is, I'm sorry to say, an old American sentiment, fear of others. Jews were coming into the United States as we'd never seen them before. Now, Jews had been in the British American colonies since the 1650s. But what happened in the start of the 20th century were these pogroms in Eastern Europe, in places like Poland and Ukraine and Russia. And they would just wail on these Jews in these villages. So in the first 15 years of the 20th century, 2 million Jews came to this country. And most of them didn't speak our language. And this greatly upset the Klan because they didn't practice the dominant religion. They spoke a different language. They seemed different. They brought their habits with them. And the immigrants from Europe were not the Nordic immigrants, but they were from the south of Europe, primarily Sicily and Greece. Now, I found this when I was in Sicily last year. Sicily had an earthquake in the early part of the 20th century that just decimated the island. It was already very poor. But in the 20 years after that, they sent 800,000 Sicilians to the United States. And that greatly, they tended to be dark-skinned. They spoke a type of Italian that most people didn't understand. Forget about understanding any Italian. And they had their wine and their rituals, and they hated that. So, number 3, race hatred. Now, this had been the hardy perennial of the Klan, of course. But it took its most institutional form with Jim Crow. As you know, after Reconstruction, one state after the other locked down Jim Crow, which basically disenfranchised 36% of the population. In some states, only 1% of African Americans could vote. And Jim Crow was locked down by a Supreme Court decision with only one dissenting justice. But the Klan of the 20s wanted to move Jim Crow to the north. So they started doing it in places like Ohio and Indiana and Missouri and Wisconsin. And they started with these local laws where they redlined, and then pretty soon they had segregated schools. So they were moving, that was one of their 20s goals, moving Jim Crow. Now, what bothered the Klan was the fact that 200,000 African Americans had served in the horrible carnage of the Great War, World War I, that trench warfare was so awful and meaningless. And when these 200,000 soldiers came home, they said, damn it, I'm going to be a citizen. I just served my country overseas. I am entitled to be a citizen. So they came home newly fired up, newly inspired to break Jim Crow. The Klan fought against that. And then finally, the fourth thing was what I mentioned earlier, the Jazz Age, the cultural exuberance, the Harlem Renaissance, women. Now, we did this very strange thing, as I mentioned, at the start of 1920. We passed the only amendment to the Constitution to take away a right, which was prohibition. But then we greatly expanded rights by granting women the vote. And the Klan was very threatened by women who were outside of the hearth, outside of the home, and these newly socially liberated women. So this was still a very secretive organization. They called themselves the Invisible Empire. And in their manuals, they said, we can operate best when no one knows who we are. And they felt that the power of the community was strongest if no one knew who they were under the hoods. Now, I found in doing this story that when the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren of all these leading citizens in these nice towns in the Midwest discovered hoods in their attic, or discovered membership lists, which are popping up here and there, that included their kin. Well, there's Grandpa. He was a member of the Klan. They did what most human beings do. They rationalized it and said, well, they were just a bunch of chuckleheads. They were just a bunch of dupes. They were just a silly organization with silly, secret rituals, and it was just another fraternal group. None of that was true, I'm sorry to say. The Klan of the 20s rose to their feet at different speeches as preachers and people would call Jews, quote, un-American parasites. And they boycotted their stores. They gave out these stickers that said TWK, Trade with Klan, which meant you were a Klan-approved store. And if you didn't have one of those stickers in your little town, your store might go out of business. They harassed and threatened Catholic clergy and nuns, and on occasion they firebombed the homes of priests. They passed laws in all parts of the North to prevent black people from moving into their neighborhoods, going to public schools of their choice, or, of course, marrying people of an opposite race. And they voted overwhelmingly for the Klan slate. And they knew what the Klan slate was because D.C. Stevenson told them what it was. In one little town in Indiana in 1923, they drove every black who lived there out of town on 3 hours' notice, drove them out of town, called a hastily assembled meeting, and drove them out of town. It got 5 paragraphs in the New York Times. And they burned crosses of terror all across the Midwest. Now, I mentioned the first Klan didn't have the cross burnings. It came from that movie. It came from Birth of a Nation. So the second Klan had seen that, and they saw it. And they burned these crosses because they were meant to intimidate. Now, they had iron brandings. They had horrible lynching, including in the North. And worst of all, you all know, it was the Tulsa Race Massacre, 1921, when one of the most prosperous African-American communities in this country, in Tulsa, was burned to the ground, and at least 300 people were murdered and buried hastily in shallow graves, and no one was ever brought to justice. A Klan lecturer said it was, quote, the best thing that ever happened to Tulsa. Membership grew 5-fold in Oklahoma after the Tulsa Race Massacre. Now, that's to emphasize the dual nature of it. On the surface, Rockwellian, just below it, terror. But also, and this is the important point, politics. They weren't going to keep everything in the basement. They weren't going to keep everything with their silly rituals. They wanted to rule this country. So by 1924, D.C. Stevenson, the Grand Dragon of Indiana, had his eye on the presidency. This guy who 4 years earlier was a nobody. He owned the governor, and that one of the 2 senators was soon to die. And Stevenson would be named to that vacant Senate seat in 1924, and 4 years later, he planned to run for president, 1928. Now, you may scoff at this, as many people do, but if you look at what happened in the 1924 nominating conventions of both parties, Democrats and Republicans, the Klan was the dominant lobbying factor. They were so dominant that Time magazine put the Imperial Wizard on its cover and said, largely positively, that the Klan got its way. The Klan got everything they wanted. Both nominating conventions had a vote on whether or not to condemn the Klan, and they voted it down. They voted it down. Both nominating conventions could not even bring themselves to condemn it. So Stevenson thinks he's untouchable. Thinks, he started to say, I am the law. I am the law. And few doubted it. He was a man who had a special power, and that was there was no bottom to his shamelessness. And I'm sorry to say that a person who has no bottom to their shamelessness has a lot of power. Most of us feel something Most of us feel a pang of conscience when we cross a line. He would go there time and again because he had no shame. Now, on August 8th, 1925, the Klan staged a mass parade in the nation's capital. 50,000 Klansmen marched in broad summer daylight from the Capitol to the Treasury building. The surprise of many reporters who interviewed these 50,000 among them was that they weren't from the South. They weren't from Georgia. They weren't from Bama. They weren't from Mississippi. They were from Indiana. They were from Ohio. They were from upstate New York. Or they were from western PA. They were from Wisconsin. They were from Colorado. They were from Oregon. That was the face of the Klan in 1925, the dominant face of the Klan. Now, at the very time this parade is going on, D.C. Stevenson, his secret life is coming out. It turns out this man who preached absolute temperance was a raging and violent alcoholic. It turned out that this man who preached that no one should be able to take a sip of liquor was a bootlegger. It turned out that this man who said that the purity of women must be protected, you saw that in a lot of the signs waved by the Ku Klux Kiddies, waved by the women. This man was a rapist. This man had raped and sexually assaulted several women. He beat his first two wives nearly to death and never was brought to justice. Cops would be called. He'd show his little badge from the militant vigilante group that I mentioned earlier, the 30,000, and nothing would ever be done for it. That's why he said, "I am the law." So the day that they staged that parade in Washington, D.C., he's finally facing a trial because of one woman. He's finally facing a trial for rape, kidnapping, and murder. And he dismisses it all. He called it, quote, a smear and a witch hunt. He said, I mean, when you hear those words, you just hear history echoing. What did they say? History rhymes. He said he was a martyr, and he compared himself to Jesus. He said, not since Jesus Christ was brought to the cross has a man been so persecuted as I, the mighty D.C. Stevenson, Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. So he's waiting trial. He's in the jail in lovely little Noblesville, Indiana. It's the trial of the century in Indiana. It's the Scopes monkey trial has already happened, 1925, a few months earlier. This is a trial that everyone's covering because the charges are so big and he's so powerful. And as this trial is going on, he sends out the slate of who the people in Indiana are supposed to vote for. While he's awaiting trial, his Klan sway is swept into office again in the state of Indiana. Even after they knew this, he has his Fifth Avenue moment. I'm sorry to make a reference to that. He's awaiting trial on rape, murder, and kidnapping, and they vote in the Klan slate. They vote a Klan, an outright, sworn on the Bible, Klansman in the largest city in Indiana, Indianapolis. He wins by 9,000 votes, the mayor does, while D.C. Stevenson is in jail. Now, I want to stress one more thing before I get to the outcome here. Another of their pushes in the 1920s was eugenics. I have a chapter called A Master Race in the Midwest, and they really wanted to breed a master race. And so they passed these involuntary sterilization laws. Indiana was the first to do it. 30 states followed their lead. And under these laws, if you were a homosexual, or if you were prone to alcohol, or if you were designated a promiscuous woman, or, God forbid, if you had epilepsy, I have a brother who has epilepsy, those were among the many things that could qualify you for involuntary sterilization. And something in the neighborhood of 70,000 people had their ability to ever bring children into this world taken away from them during this period. Now, I never like to use Nazi analogies because it always kills every conversation. But I'll just say for the historical record, when the Nazis in the 1930s adopted their own eugenics laws in which they got rid of, they didn't just sterilize them, they killed them, undesirables, they said, and it's in the records, that Indiana was their model, that the eugenics rule they got was from the Midwest. The highlight of this Klan of the 20s was little Kokomo, Indiana, a town of 30,000 people. And on one 4th of July day, hot summer day, 200,000 people, the largest rally in the history of the Klan by far. No place ever came close to it. 200,000 people showed up in the cornfields of Kokomo wearing their sheets, robes, and masks. And D.C. Stevenson came down in a plane from the sky like he was God himself and got out with his purple robe and said, "Welcome to all my subjects." And they bowed down. And one of his aides said if he had asked them to flap their wings and fly, they would have flapped their arms and tried to take off. He was a God among men. That was the peak. That was the absolute peak. Now, despite all this, and despite writing now my 10th book and doing a lot of time traveling on history, I am an optimist. I still believe in our better angels. Now, sometimes our better angels get their asses kicked by the worst angels. In Indiana, there were some heroes. In Indiana, there were some resistors. In Indiana, there were people who formed a group called Tolerance. And they were Jews, blacks, led by an Irish-American immigrant named Patrick O'Donnell, who was a lawyer. And their plan was simple. If the Klan was the invisible empire, they would make them visible. They would unmask them. So what they did once a week in their newspaper, Tolerance, they printed a list of names of all the Klansmen in the community. So they were unmasking them. They had sources inside these Klan dens that gave them the names of sworn Klansmen. And so they Tolerance proudly printed these lists. But what happened? Instead of shaming them, instead of running them out of town and getting them to give up their robes, it was validating. People looked at those lists and they said, "Oh, well, I know him and I know her, and that's my banker, and that's the guy that delivers my milk. Well, geez, I better join." If you didn't belong to the Klan, you were an outsider. So it ended up completely backfiring, the unmasking. Now, by 1925, on the eve of Stevenson's trial, the Klan had accomplished all of its major goals. They had prohibition, as I mentioned. They had this immigration law of 1924 called the National Origins Act. It was aimed at Jews, and it was aimed at Southern Europeans. Forget about Asians, they couldn't get in. Forget about Africans, they couldn't get in. But it's primarily meant to stop Jews and Southern Europeans from ever coming into this country. It drastically cut off immigration by more than 95%. And many scholars have estimated that up to 2 million Jews in Eastern Europe who were slaughtered by Hitler in the Holocaust would have otherwise lived had they, in a normal immigration period, come to the United States, but they were prohibited because of this 1924 law, which was the Klan's big thing. The New York Times had a headline when this law passed: "America of the melting pot comes to an end." And finally, their final goal was Jim Crow of the North. It was happening, in Oregon. It was happening in Colorado. It was happening all over Indiana. They were redlining. They were segregating the schools. Jim Crow was moving north. So what brought them down finally? What brought them down? I've written about Teddy Roosevelt, and I've written about Lincoln, and I've written about a lot of great Americans, Edward Curtis, the great photographer of American Indians. But I've always interested in the people at the margins, the people who get written out of the story, the people who don't have statues at the town square, the people who don't have bold-faced names at the start of the history books. And this is a story, the subtitle here is "The Woman Who Stopped Them." She's the woman got written out of the story. She's the woman at the margins. Her name was Madge Oberholzer. She was 28 years old. She was a school teacher, and then she was head of a literacy program with the state of Indiana. She lived at home with her parents. And in the eve of the Stevensons, just before Stevenson was arrested, she went to him because she wanted to save her job. And the only way to save her job was to go to the Grand Dragon who ruled the state. And he started asking her out. He was fairly aggressive and strange, but she thought, if I just hang out with this guy a couple times, it'll all be over. I control the play. It'll save my job and help my folks, because she was paying rent to her folks so they could stay in their house. Well, I don't want to give away too much of the story, but I will say there was a horrible collision. And this monster, D.C. Stevenson, committed a monstrous act with Madge Oberholzer. And once again, he thought I was going to get away with it. "I am the law," is what he said. It's a smear. It's a witch hunt. They're out to get me. They're out to get you. But Madge would not roll over. Every institutional force that had gone against the Klan had failed. Their number one opponent, surprisingly, in Indiana was the University of Notre Dame, because it was the premier Catholic school. The Klan wanted to drop a bomb on the Golden Dome. And one day in May of 1924, the Klan had this huge rally in South Bend where the students didn't like that. They didn't like these smears and libels on their faith. Their president of the school said, don't engage them, stay in lockdown at the campus. But they disobeyed, and hundreds of students went down, and this was kind of funny considering most of them were Irish American kids. They threw potatoes at the parading Klansmen. And the next day there was a headline in the Chicago paper that said, Notre Dame students routs Klan. And to this day, they're called the Fighting Irish because of what happened in that riot of 1924. So they had one good day where they routed the Klan, but they never were able to knock them out. So they failed. The NAACP, a rising force led by James Weldon Johnson, a wonderful literary polymath, a musician, an incredibly gifted, talented, culturally exuberant man, came to Indiana several times and said, damn it, nobody has been more loyal to the Republican Party for the first 50 years since we got the vote than African Americans. And folks, we're going to bolt if you don't denounce the Klan. He sent letters to Calvin Coolidge, Silent Cal, and Cal remained silent, didn't say anything. So the NAACP bolted. They didn't necessarily go to the Democrats because, as you know, in the South, the Democrats were real thick with the Klan, but they parked themselves in the middle. They said, we're not going to be loyal to either party. And then they eventually went Democrat, starting with Franklin Roosevelt's election in 1932, and never looked back. But they failed to bring down the Klan in Indiana. It came and fell to Madge Oberholzer, this 28-year-old single woman, school teacher, living at home with her parents, to finally bring the Grand Dragon down. And I don't want to spoil the story. It's not my job. But Madge's words in a court of law were finally what put this monster away, and in so doing, exposed what the Klan was really like. Now, remember I said they won the election while it was a waiting trial, but during the trial, all this stuff came out. And they saw the dark heart of this terror group, and they saw the dark heart of D.C. Stevenson, this absolute monster who ruled Indiana. Now, because it's a hard story, I again want to stress that some hope, like orange juice, can be squeezed from this story. One of the things, I have a chapter on this, was jazz. We, that is the United States, gave the world this uniquely American art form in the 1920s. On the same day in Richmond, Indiana, which is a little town on the border of Ohio, staged the largest Klan rally in its history, 40,000 people, complete with a Klan airplane going overhead, in a little studio shed just blocks from where these Klansmen were marching. Louis Armstrong and his band cut the first all African-American recorded jazz album that went on to be a sensation. Now, this was the only studio apparently between New York and the coast where you could record record quality stuff. It was Jeanette Studio, run by some Italian-American immigrants. So they had to scurry to get out of town and avoid this Klan rally, but the music lived much longer than the Klan. There was a newspaper editor, George Dale, a 98-pound, 60-year-old guy who got the crap beat out of him and was thrown in the penal farm by a Klan judge because he criticized this Klan judge in the pages of his newspaper. In Muncie, Indiana, where he had his paper, the First Amendment did not apply. You can't criticize a judge. He threw this editor in jail without a trial in the penal farm and held him. He was heroic. There were several rabbis who'd organized with the group Tolerance. One was a man who showed up. The Klan had dared him to show up at one of his rallies. So they held this night meeting at, of all places, a cemetery with the flaming crosses. And this lone rabbi showed up and called them a bunch of gutless cowards. And then he walked out, head held high. So there were good people that fought the Klan, but again, it fell to Madge. So I want to close in this thought. We're going through a very troubled time right now. Even my optimism, American democracy had a really close call in 1920. Had Madge not come along, the Klan their imperial wizard thought they would go from 6 million to 20 million. He said, most Americans are with us. So they were going to run their guy for the White House in 1928, and certainly they had Klan sympathetic people all over in power. So we had a real close call. And we have a great debate going on right now in how to teach this history. I'm here in an auditorium, happy to be here in an auditorium among lovers of history, among people who are not afraid of history, among people who know that history, like the human race itself, has many sides. It's not a smiley button, and nor is it a demon, but it has multiple facets. And some states may ban this book because, maybe it doesn't make you feel good about the United States history. It makes me feel good because of the heroic people who fought these bastards, the heroic people who beat them down, the people who eventually finally won. So I agree with my friend Ken Burns. We did a documentary together on the Dust Bowl. He was adapting my book on the Dust Bowl for a doc. I got to know Ken pretty well up in his North Pole of documentaries up in New Hampshire, where he basically employs every individual in that town. And he wrote a piece the other day in the midst of this roiling debate about how much of our history to teach. And he said, being an American means reckoning with a history that is going to be fraught with violence and injustice. But ignoring that reality in favor of mythology is not only wrong, but it's dangerous. The dark chapters of our history have just as much to teach us, just as much, if not more, than the glorious ones. And often the two are intertwined. And that's what happened here. The dark chapters are intertwined with the glorious ones. I think, and this should be a simple proposition, folks, a truly great nation is one that can acknowledge its failures. Thank you. So I'll take a couple questions, and there's a floating microphone here.
Except for Notre Dame, you didn't mention any universities. And universities today are the midst of wokeism. What did this man do with the universities with his movement?
Wait, I only heard part of your question. Something about Notre Dame?
I was interested in what role the universities played in this movement. Did the
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. My apology. Yeah, so it was two things. It was led by the students, and it was led by some of the Catholic faculty there who were working with this. I mentioned this guy who started this newspaper, Tolerance, and he had obtained a bunch of documents that showed they were going to bomb the Golden Dome, and they were going to raid they thought there was a cache of weapons underneath the campus, because then the fear of Catholics was driven by they thought it was a plot by the Pope, that their loyalty was all to the Pope. And so they were going to attack Notre Dame, the Klan was. And Notre Dame's pushback was, writing editorials, doing civil discourse, and then finally they just got sick of it, and they attacked these Klansmen in the raid. That was pretty much it. Yeah, that was pretty much it. Oh, I didn't mention, at the height of his power, Stevenson wanted to buy his own university, Valparaiso. And he was pretty damn close to doing it. Valparaiso was failing. They needed someone to bail him out. He'd raised $300,000, which was a lot of money back then. And he was going to have a 100% American Klan certified school. And he came this close at the last minute. There was a dispute going on with him and the other bigwig in the Klan, this Hiram Wesley Evans, and it was mainly over the spoils of the Klan. As I said, it was a huge, almost a Ponzi scheme, huge money-making operation. And this other guy didn't want to spend the money on buying the college. Stevenson wanted the college so he could turn out, real Americans one after the other in this Klan college. Yes.
Hi, you mentioned a couple already. I was curious if there are any, when you do these talks and you travel, are there any misconceptions that the average American has about the Klan that just drive you crazy? That, you mentioned about the North, that's one thing. People think it's a Southern it was dominant in the South more than the North. But are there any other misconceptions about the Klan that just kind of the average American believes?
And I mentioned this, and I'll just repeat it. Thanks for the question. It's a hard thing to recognize, but the misconception is people think the Klan was a criminal element mainly back then. Just people who already had criminal records or were prone to violence. But again, on the surface, it was not. On the surface, it was as normal as you could be. On the surface, it was just a picture of mainstream America in the 1920s with all these barbershop quartets. A big deal was to burn a flaming cross just before the fireworks on 4th of July. A big deal was to burn a flaming cross after a Christmas week sleigh ride. So the big misconception is that these were the D.C. Stevenson types, but in fact, he was a con man who said things that people wanted to hear, and he played to their fears. And he told them that their failures as human beings was not their fault. It was other people's faults. So they could blame other people. They could blame Jews. They could blame blacks. They could blame immigrants. They could blame the others. And there's, it's not limited to our country, but a skillful con man can get away with an awful lot. So that's how these so-called average people, Indiana still doesn't teach this story. It's there. I found it in their historical center. They did a good job of preserving it. You cannot open a newspaper from the 1920s in Indiana without seeing some Klan headline. Kokomo, which I mentioned where this Klan rally happened, had regular praiseworthy notations of the upcoming Klan meetings right next to the weather forecast. The paper in Noblesville, Indiana, had something called Klan Comment, KlanKomment. And that was just an affirmation daily of Klan values. So I guess the misconception was people, again, it makes you feel better if you could say, well, they're a bunch of thugs and criminals and losers, but they were not. I mean, they had hatred in their hearts, which is sad, but they were normal people.
Thanks, Tim. This is fantastic. Two questions. One, struggling still to understand why it was that the Klan located in the North instead of the South. Why Indiana, of all states? Why not Alabama or Mississippi, first of all? And then secondly, in the introduction to your book, there's a quotation about somebody just talking about building a wall to keep immigrants out of the United States, which of course harkens to what we've lived, with Donald Trump in the last few years, and clearly an example of history repeating itself.
Yeah.
And I'm curious what you see is going to happen, if Donald Trump comes back in 18 months.
So the building of the wall quote was from the governor of Georgia. And he said, we should build a wall as high as heaven to keep all immigrants out. So they wanted to just freeze society. And everyone remembers that horrible tiki torch march of a few years ago, a year into the Trump presidency, where they had their little flaming things and they said, Jews will not replace us. Well, that's exact same thing the Klan of the 20s said. They had the replacement theory then, that Jews and other immigrants were going to replace us, that blacks moving to the North were replacing. Now, I'll try to answer your question about Indiana. This is as near as I can answer. Now, I don't want to I'm having such a wonderful day in Atlanta, but I don't want to let you guys off the hook. The second Klan did start here, after all, on Stone Mountain. And you got that, that memorial out there on some rock. Indiana was the most homogeneous of all American states. It was 94% white Protestant. They didn't have very many blacks. They had hardly any Jews. That rabbi I spoke of, he had a real minority congregation. Even Catholics were relatively small. It was incredibly homogeneous. Everyone pretty much looked alike, went to the same Protestant churches. They had not a hint of ethnicity to them. No Italian, Americans, this was all happening elsewhere. And what Stevenson did was to say, it's coming to you. It's coming to your state. Yeah, you're seeing it in New York now. Yeah, you're seeing it in Chicago. Chicago was always a big, bogeyman. Well, soon it's coming to Indiana. So I think it's the fact that everyone looked alike, had the same beliefs. It was easy to have fear of others. So in Chicago, when that newspaper Tolerance unmasked all these Klansmen, they busted the Klan. The reaction there was different. They boycotted the banks. They shut down these merchants, and they stopped going to these merchants. They threw two council members out who were Klansmen in Chicago because there was much more of a racial and an ethnic mix. And so Indiana was just, everyone looked and felt the same. And so it was a kind of a perfect place to have this, And then you can't stress enough how they got the clergy to bless them. I mean, it was a terrorist group, but it was sanctified. I quote in this book a bunch of Sunday sermons by the leading preachers, which they praise Klan values, And so there were certainly active Klan all over the South during the 20s. Don't get me wrong. William Simmons started it out of Georgia as well. He was another itinerant minister who didn't practice what he preached. He had a weakness for prostitution and alcohol, while of course preaching against sex and booze. So there were tons of Klan dens in the South, but it's just that they took hold it ripped through the North. It ripped through the North, and really quickly too. Yes?
I'll come over there.
Like that don't just automatically die when the leader goes down. Were there splinter groups, or was there any kind of groups that benefited or kind of picked up the mantle of the Klan?
Yeah, so I'm not sure this is a direct answer to your question, but I'll try to answer that. So I didn't go into this enough, but the Klan cratered after the trial of Madge Oberholzer because it was exposed in this trial of the century as being, and then there were similar events that happened around the country. About 3 different places, the Grand Dragons were exposed as being child molesters or rapists. I mean, it usually involves sex and some monstrous sexual crime. So they were exposed as absolute hypocrites. But I have an alternative theory that they cratered because they got everything they wanted. I mean, I mentioned all the things they asked for: Jim Crow, or Prohibition, Immigration Act, Eugenics. They got all of that. So there wasn't the great need. They felt like they'd accomplished most of their goals. But it has never come close since then. So the Klan revived in the 60s in reaction to the civil rights, and it was horrible, and they were murderous and monstrous, but it wasn't a fraction of what it was in the 1920s. And now, if you go to a podium anywhere in the United States of America and proclaim yourself a proud knight of the Ku Klux Klan, that's toxic. But then it was, you go to someone and proclaim yourself a Klansman, they'd say, howdy neighbor. So I'll take one more question. Yes, sir.
Oh, I was wondering, what is the relation over on Peachtree Road? There was the Imperial Palace. How is that relate to?
Yeah, that's a great story. The Imperial Palace was the mansion that the Klan, when it was so prosperous, they were just, I told you, it was a Ponzi scheme. They were just making a killing off these average Americans. And what broke up the Klan leadership was the fights over the spoils. But the original, the 1915 founder, they dethroned him in a duplicitous act at a convention here in Atlanta. But they let him stay in the Imperial Palace, which was he considered it his, like he was a king and this was his palace, and puttered around. In the 1930s, this is a great twist of history, the Klan, what was left of it, went totally bankrupt. And the Catholic Church ended up taking over the Imperial Palace and made it into a church. It's a great twist. Thank you, guys. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. We will meet you out in the lobby for a book signing, and there's also additional copies for purchase. Thank you so much.